Marcus Carter had spent years working tirelessly at Langston & Co., only to be belittled, overlooked, and humiliated by his arrogant boss, Richard Langston. But when a sudden shakeup in leadership turns the tables, Marcus finds himself in a position no one, especially Richard, ever expected. The man who once mocked him now has to answer to him. As Marcus steps into power, he faces a choice: seek revenge or rise above. What follows is a story of resilience, justice, and the kind of leadership that changes everything. Because sometimes, karma doesn't take years, it only takes days. The towering glass skyscraper of Langston & Co. loomed over the bustling city, its polished facade reflecting the golden hues of the early morning sun. Inside, the corporate office buzzed with activity. Employees in pressed suits hurried to their desks, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air as keyboards clattered and hushed conversations filled the open-concept workspace. It was the kind of office where appearances mattered just as much as performance, where ambition was both a currency and a weapon. At his desk near the large windows sat Marcus Carter, a diligent and highly skilled financial analyst. He had spent years proving himself in an industry that often overlooked people like him, Black professionals who had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Despite his dedication, Marcus found himself constantly overshadowed by colleagues who networked their way into promotions rather than earned them. He was a man of numbers, logic, and hard work, but in an office where politics often trumped talent, he remained just another name on the payroll. Marcus had joined the company fresh out of college, fueled by dreams of climbing the corporate ladder. But over the years, he had come to realize that no matter how many late nights he worked or how many successful projects he led, true advancement remained just out of reach. The reason? Richard Langston, his manager, a man who embodied every stereotype of the out-of-touch, condescending corporate elite. Richard, a middle-aged executive with an inflated sense of self-importance, had inherited his position more than he had earned it. He had the charm to schmooze with the board but lacked the strategic foresight to truly lead. What he excelled at, however, was maintaining his power, often at the expense of those beneath him. He looked down on Marcus, barely acknowledging his contributions, dismissing his ideas in meetings, and always ensuring that credit for successes trickled upward, never downward. For Richard, Marcus was just another employee, someone he could order around without a second thought. If Marcus came up with an innovative idea, Richard would shoot it down, only to present it as his own later. If Marcus met a difficult deadline, Richard would take the praise, leaving Marcus with nothing but exhaustion. And if Marcus ever showed ambition, Richard made sure to remind him of his place in the hierarchy. To Richard, Marcus was invisible when things went well and a scapegoat when they didn't. But what Richard didn't know was that the tides were about to turn. And soon, the employee he so easily dismissed would become the one thing he never expected: his boss. Marcus had spent weeks poring over data, analyzing market trends, and perfecting a financial report that could significantly improve the company's investment strategies. It was the kind of work that, if recognized, could elevate his career and prove his worth beyond any doubt. He knew he had crafted something brilliant, something that would impress even the company's senior executives. The morning of the presentation, Marcus walked into the boardroom with confidence, carrying a stack of reports and a detailed slideshow to illustrate his findings. The room was filled with department heads, analysts, and, of course, Richard Langston, who sat at the head of the long glass table with his usual air of self-importance. As Marcus spoke, he noticed heads nodding in approval. Even the senior executives were engaged, flipping through his report with interest. For a brief moment he felt hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the breakthrough he needed. Then Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and let out a condescending chuckle. "That was interesting," Richard said, cutting through the positive energy in the room. "But let's be honest, Carter. This is basic analysis. Nothing groundbreaking. I'd expect something a little more sophisticated at this level." The air in the room shifted. Some executives exchanged awkward glances, sensing the unfairness of the critique. Marcus, stunned, tried to respond professionally. With all due respect, sir, the data supports. Richard held up a hand, silencing him. I appreciate your effort, Marcus, but let's not kid ourselves. We both know why you're here. He smirked. Diversity initiatives are important after all. A cold silence settled over the room. The implication was clear. Richard was suggesting that Marcus's position in the company wasn't earned, but rather a product of corporate tokenism. A few employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Before Marcus could process the insult, Richard added another blow. Why don't you take a break from the heavy lifting and handle something more suited for you? The coffee machine's been acting up. Mind fixing that? He smirked, tossing his empty cup toward Marcus's end of the table. Laughter rippled through the room, not from everyone, but enough to make Marcus's face burn with humiliation. His fingers curled into a fist beneath the table, but he refused to let his anger show. He had worked too hard to let this moment define him. Instead, he took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and gave Richard a measured look. Of course, sir, he said smoothly. I'll handle it. He walked out of the boardroom, but not in defeat, because what Richard didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that change was coming. And soon, it would be Marcus who would have the last word. 3. The turning point. Marcus left the boardroom with his head high, but his heart burned with anger. The humiliation still clung to him, the sound of muffled laughter ringing in his ears. He had given his best, only to be dismissed, belittled, and insulted in front of his colleagues. He knew he couldn't afford to react emotionally. He had seen too many people like Richard wield their power carelessly, crushing careers without a second thought. As he sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, his mind raced. What more could he possibly do to prove himself? How much harder did he have to work just to be treated with the same respect freely given to others? He clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to lash out or walk away. He wouldn't give Richard the satisfaction of seeing him broken. That evening, as he sat in his apartment nursing a glass of water, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. For a brief second, he considered ignoring it, assuming it was another spam call, but something told him to pick up. Marcus Carter speaking. Marcus, this is Eleanor Grayson, Senior Vice President at Langston & Company. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. His breath caught slightly. Eleanor was one of the most powerful executives in the company, a name that carried weight in the corporate world. Not at all, ma'am, Marcus responded, sitting up straight. I had the pleasure of reviewing your recent market analysis report, Eleanor continued. It was exceptional, far beyond what we typically see. I also heard about what happened in today's meeting. There was a pause. I won't sugarcoat it. Richard has a reputation for mismanaging talent, and frankly, it's becoming a liability. Marcus stayed silent, unsure of what to say. I'll get to the point, Eleanor said. We're making changes. Richard's position is being reevaluated, and we need strong leadership to step up. Your work speaks for itself. How would you feel about taking on a senior management role? Marcus's heart pounded. Was he hearing this right? A leadership position? He echoed. You've proven yourself more than capable. We need someone who understands the business and has the vision to move it forward. I'd like you to come in tomorrow so we can discuss the details. Marcus gripped his phone tighter. This was the moment he had waited for. Validation, recognition, and most importantly, a chance to change the game. Thank you, ma'am. I'd love to discuss this further, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Good. I look forward to seeing you in the morning, Eleanor replied before hanging up. Marcus sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle in. Everything was about to change, and the best part? Richard had no idea what was coming. 4. The big change. The atmosphere at Langston & Company was different that morning. There was an unusual energy in the air, a hushed tension, as though the entire office sensed that something big was about to happen. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering over their coffee cups, exchanging knowing glances. Something was brewing, and the anticipation was palpable. At exactly 10 a.m., an email landed in everyone's inbox with the subject line, "Leadership Announcement. Effective immediately." The message was brief and to the point. Richard Langston had been removed from his position due to concerns about his leadership and workplace culture. Effective immediately, his role would be filled by Marcus Carter, who was being promoted to Senior Director of Financial Strategy. The reaction was instant. The same colleagues who had laughed along with Richard just days earlier were now buzzing with shock. Some were surprised, others were impressed, and a few, particularly those who had witnessed Richard's treatment of Marcus, felt a quiet sense of justice. As Marcus walked into the office that morning, he felt the shift in the way people looked at him. No longer just another employee, no longer overlooked or underestimated. He was now in charge. At precisely noon, a meeting was called in the same boardroom where Richard had humiliated him. Marcus took his seat at the head of the table, the very spot Richard used to claim so arrogantly. A few moments later, the man himself walked in, his usual smug confidence noticeably absent. Richard's face was tight with barely contained anger, but he forced a stiff nod in Marcus's direction. He was no longer the boss. He was reporting to Marcus now. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady, his expression composed. "I want to start by acknowledging the transition we're experiencing. Leadership changes can be challenging, but I want to assure you that my priority is fostering a culture of innovation, respect, and accountability." He made no mention of Richard's behavior, no gloating, no petty remarks, just professionalism. That was the difference between a true leader and a man like Richard. As the meeting continued, Marcus laid out his vision for the department: greater collaboration, fair recognition of talent, and an emphasis on performance over politics. Employees who had once been afraid to speak up under Richard's rule now listened intently, nodding in approval. Richard, meanwhile, sat there silently, forced to listen to the man he had belittled, now leading the very team he once controlled. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear. A new era had begun at Langston & Co. And Marcus? He had earned every bit of it. The confrontation. The weight of his new role had settled on Marcus's shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, he felt empowered. This was his moment, not just to lead, but to set a new standard for how leadership should be exercised. But there was one thing left to handle: Richard Langston. Despite his demotion, Richard had yet to approach Marcus directly. He had sat through meetings with forced politeness, his jaw tight as Marcus outlined plans for restructuring the team. He had swallowed the bitter pill of being outranked by the very man he had humiliated just days before. But avoidance could only last so long. Late that afternoon, Marcus called Richard into his office. It was an interesting reversal. Marcus sitting behind the desk, Richard standing in front of it. The same dynamic Richard had once used to belittle Marcus was now flipped. But unlike Richard, Marcus wasn't going to make this personal. Richard entered stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back. His usual arrogance had faded, replaced with something else: unease, maybe even resentment. He sat down without being asked, a forced smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "So, I guess this is where you get your revenge, huh?" Richard muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Gonna make me fetch your coffee now?" Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers interlaced on the desk. There it was, the insecurity disguised as a joke, the attempt to deflect. But Marcus wasn't here for petty games. "I don't operate like that," Marcus said, his voice measured. "That's the difference between us." Richard's smirk faltered slightly. "I didn't call you in here to humiliate you, Richard," Marcus continued. "I called you in because I need to address something: your behavior." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on." "I need you to listen." Marcus's tone was firm but calm. For years, you abused your position. You dismissed people who worked hard. You took credit for ideas that weren't yours. And let's not forget your diversity initiative comment in that boardroom. Richard's face darkened, but Marcus pressed on. I'm not here to punish you, he said. I'm here to set the tone. This department, this company, is going to move forward with fairness and respect. That means real leadership, not just a title on a business card. Richard swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. He was used to power plays, used to belittling people into submission. But this was something different. Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment before finishing. If you can adapt to that, then there's a place for you here. If not, well, that's your decision. Richard looked away, his pride wounded, his arrogance deflated. For the first time, he had no smart comeback. I'll get back to work, Richard muttered before standing up. Marcus nodded. You should. As Richard left the office, shoulders tense, Marcus knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Langston and Comey changed, not just in leadership, but in culture. Under Marcus's direction, the financial strategy department became a place where ideas were valued based on merit, not office politics. Employees who had once felt overlooked now had a voice, and team meetings became discussions rather than performances for higher-ups. Marcus wasted no time in implementing changes. Credit was given where it was due. Promotions were based on skill and contribution, not favoritism. A mentorship program was introduced to support young and underrepresented talent within the company. His approach was clear. Leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. As for Richard Langston, he faced a choice: adapt or leave. At first, he resisted. He sulked through meetings, his arrogance bruised, his once dominant voice now reduced to another seat at the table. Some thought he might quit outright, unable to bear working under the very man he had tried to keep down. But pride, ironically, kept him there. Richard had built his entire career on self-preservation, and walking away meant admitting defeat. But staying meant facing a new reality, one where his usual tactics no longer worked. The employees who once feared him now reported to Marcus, and under Marcus's leadership, they thrived. There was no more room for favoritism, backhanded remarks, or dismissing talent. Slowly, Richard realized that if he wanted to survive in this company, he would have to change. One afternoon, as Marcus was wrapping up a report in his office, a knock came at the door. When he looked up, Richard stood there. For a moment, the two men simply regarded each other. The tension that had once defined their relationship had shifted. There was no fear, no resentment, just an unspoken acknowledgement of the new order. Richard cleared his throat. You've done a good job, Carter. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but he didn't smirk or gloat. That wasn't his style. Instead, he simply nodded. Thanks. Richard hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but instead, he turned and left. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling. The man who had once controlled his future was now just another employee in a company where real leadership had finally taken root. With that, Marcus didn't look back. He had a department to lead, a vision to fulfill, and a future that was finally his to own.